この大自然の局所域に生命性を発現させるのなら、その個体内に自由度を内在させ、自己確立と自己意識を成立させる同時機能があるはず。量子力学的思考としての人間の意志や直感は、マクロな神経系の励起として発振しない。
The year is 480 BC. The Persians have mounted an army of 300,000 men, the largest in history up till that time. It's a size army that the Romans would later use to dominate the entire Mediterranean. The leader of the Persians, Xerxes, a man of such stature during his time that even people of other nations referred to him simply as the king, had decided to launch the full fury of this force against a single city, Athens. The situation in Athens was serious. The Athenians figured that if anyone could come up with a solution to this particular problem, though, it may well be them. They were, after all, renowned for their ingenuity and their rational intellects. They had recently invented democracy and tragedy, and within a decade would see the birth of Socrates and philosophy as we know it. So they did what any rational people would do in such a situation. They deliberated. They gathered information. They used rules of logic to draw inferences. They used public debate to test their conclusions. And with careful arguments, they considered their courses of action. After grinding away at it, they did what any rational group of people would do at that time. They sent away for an oracle. The Pythia was the most authoritative oracle of the day. She was an aging, frail, illiterate woman housed in a massive stone temple at Delphi. She took questions from her petitioners, and she dispensed answers in the form of riddles. The Athenian answer was grim. But there was one small glimmer of hope. The Pythia said that only a wooden wall will remain unconquered. The embassy took this riddle back to their city, and a debate which had been meandering in many different directions quickly crystallized around two potential options. Either hole up in the traditional stronghold of the Acropolis, which had been surrounded by a wooden fence, or use wood to build a navy to take on Xerxes at sea and cut off his supply lines. The second course of action prevailed, and Athens survived and thrived. Now, we might wonder, why did they do this? Why did they rely on an oracle? Why did they imagine, especially this group of people that was an emblem for rational thinking, why did they imagine that a person with no knowledge base could provide any pertinent insight into their situation? And this was no aberration. The Greeks were in the habit of turning to oracles and also used many other techniques when they ran up to the limits of their own rational thinking. They were interested in the instinctual behaviors of animals like the flight paths and screeches of birds. They were interested in their dreams, and they spent time examining the pulsating entrails of the animals they sacrificed to their gods. They called it the study of divine signs, or divination. Seems like strange behavior, yes? Well, in the next 10 minutes, I'm going to try to persuade you of two things. Number one, it wasn't strange, and number two, you still do it. My field is classics, the study of Greece and Rome, and when scholars in my discipline take on this question, they typically pull out two kinds of answers. Number one comes from a vantage of social history. It's imagined that what we have is an elite group that has a strategy, and they use the ostentatious mystery of divine signs in order to persuade the masses to come their way. They form consensus, and they manage dissent. But there's a problem for this idea. The problem is that most situations of divination, despite our example, were not relevant to politics. Most had to do with matters of personal and even intimate concern. Should I be involved in a business deal with this person? Should I take a trip on this day? Should I marry this man? These things have nothing to do with the dynamic between the elite and the masses. There's a further problem, which is, according to all the evidence that we have, even in situations of politics, the elites thought it worked just as much as the masses did. So if the elites were pulling the wool over anyone's eyes, they were pulling the wool over their own eyes as well, Doesn't quite hold up. Another kind of explanation comes out, and it starts from the idea of superstition. We're told that primitive brains are superstitious, and the corollary is that ours aren't. And they're prone to exotic theological commitments, and so they believe in strange things. But there's a problem with this line of thinking as well. While it may well be a part of the behavior of divination, it doesn't necessarily explain the behavior of divination. While superstition may have something to do with it, it doesn't necessarily lead to the behaviors that we see in divination. It's not as though when there's sufficient amount of superstition in the air, all of a sudden people think that the universe is coursing with hidden messages that are readable by these techniques. A final kind of explanation, which is the category of no explanation, suggests that, well, lots of people do weird things and cultures have strange beliefs, so may well be no explanation. This is just a weird Mediterranean behavior, and we've grown out of that kind of thing, thank goodness. There's a problem here as well, though. It wasn't just the Greeks who did this kind of thing. In fact, all ancient cultures for which we have evidence, from the southern tip of Africa to northern Britannia and from eastern to western Eurasia, were in the habit, when they ran up against the limits of their rational thinking, to turning to techniques that took over for them and allowed them to advance their problems. The techniques vary. The Chinese took tortoise shells and put them in fire and then read the cracks that happened afterwards, but the structure of thinking is the same. If we're going to propose that this is some kind of mass delusion, we'd need some explanation for why the mass delusion is so consistent across human cultures that had functionally nothing to do with one another in many different areas of the world. Superstition is a very weak answer. Now, in my work on the arcane past, things took the most important turn for me when I took a brief tour into the present time, a time I don't spend that much time in, and it's strange and bizarre for me. I spent a year with a team of researchers at the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. This is mainly a group of cognitive scientists, evolutionary biologists, and behavioral psychologists who are pushing the envelope of understanding of the complexities of our cognitive lives. Most of us, and I surely at the time, have a standard picture of how our brains work. We set out on a problem, we direct our awareness to it, we self-consciously gather facts, and using logical rules, we draw inferences, we reach conclusions that then motivate our actions. Let's call this discursive thinking. But this is only part of the story. The researchers at the center were expanding this view and opening up fields that I would call non-discursive thinking, things that don't quite answer to that description of the way our brains work. And some of the pieces that they were coming on were ringing bells for me, struck me as very familiar. One scholar was working on face-to-face conversations. He looked at how we continuously and unself-consciously process nonverbal cues in our conversation partners, and that these shape the top-level thinking that emerges from such events. The oracular consultation was famously interactive, the bell is ringing in my head, and someone even without a knowledge base may well discern from just seeing how a person reacts to different suggestions what the most useful one is going to be in a particular situation. Another cognitive scientist was studying the phenomena of thin slicing. This is a claim that our snap judgments are sometimes as good, and for some things better than, our most careful deliberative processes. The examination of entrails instantly came to mind for me. In situations like this, often in the heat of battle, where debate is coursing around from many different pieces, taking into account many different pieces of information, the cutting open of a live animal, usually a large one, has a way of focusing people's attention. And focusing on the splayed innards of another animal interrupts the conversation. While the diviner is staring at that, it's imagined the diviner comes up with a snap judgment, not a considered decision. And while rule books for such things were legendary in antiquity, none of them survive. And I think none of them ever existed. It's not about applying rules to a particular situation. It's about making a snap judgment in the heat of the moment. There were also scholars at the center who were working at laying out the strong gains that people accrue when they're dealing with complex problems after they've been grinding it out for a while, to set their attention on something else for a while and allow their non-conscious minds to advance the problem. Their non-conscious minds have power and can advance the problem. When they return to it later, things look different and clearer than they did before. Nearly all the techniques of antiquity did this kind of a thing. As an historian of ideas, this got me to thinking, discursively, I think. And I was interested now in looking at non-discursive thinking historically. Over time, there are different manifestations of this. In the contemporary period, we usually, in polite company anyway, we use the term intuition to describe these things. We may well refer to the famous phrase of Malcolm Gladwell, thinking without thinking. A century and a half ago, in the wake of Darwin, in the middle of the 19th century, when physiology was the queen of the sciences, there was a different way of talking about it. These scientists were fascinated by the reflex action that they could observe in the musculature of our bodies, and they proposed that there were congruent kinds of actions happening in our thinking. They called this unconscious cerebration. 2 centuries before that, the English poet John Milton has the archangel Raphael explain to Adam in the Garden of Eden that the creatures of the universe think in 2 different ways. There is discursive thinking, which is what humans mostly do, and then he says there's something else called intuition, which is mostly the way angels think. On occasion, humans get a chance to think like angels, but it happens rarely. This opened up a whole new vantage on Greek divination for me. It started to look less like an outlier and more like the tale of a long and consistent arc of human cognitive history that attested to a core human experience. We oftentimes find ourselves in a situation of knowing things without knowing quite how we know them. This led me to propose an axiom. Here's my axiom. Our ability to know exceeds our capacity to understand that ability. Let me repeat. Our ability to know exceeds our capacity to understand that ability. And if it's true, as an axiom, it held in the past, it holds good now, and even despite the ingenious work of our cognitive scientists, it will hold into the future. We will remain to some degree mysterious to ourselves. The axiom tells us that there will be surplus knowledge. Surplus knowledge is provocative, it provokes some accounting for it, and by the axiom, that accounting won't be exactly right, but that accounting needs to be culturally useful. So back to the ancient world, I gained a different kind of perspective on what they were up to after spending time with these cognitive scientists. When they took time out of their deliberative thinking to change focus on a puzzling riddle, cracks in a tortoiseshell, or the erratic flight paths or screeches of a bird, they were engaging in their own local variant of the culturally authorized techniques for opening a space for non-discursive thinking to happen. This was not an example, mainly, of them engaging in exotic theological commitments because of superstitious brains. It was not an example of them trying to manipulate the masses with ostentatious mystery. That's not why they did this. They did this because it worked. Our non-conscious brain has power, and they had ways of putting it to use. And finishing back up into the present time, my claim that you do this kind of thing? Well, whenever you're facing a multivariable question over a complex data set in a situation you really care about and you need to take a break, chances are you probably do something. You clean your desk, you take a walk, you take a shower, you sleep on it. These are our culture's authorized forms for opening up a break in discursive thinking and allowing our unself-conscious, non-discursive mind to take over for a while. According to our best authorities today, this improves our chances of making headway, and according to the authorities from antiquity, whom I must say I trust a little bit more, you should definitely do this. You may well defeat a great empire. Thank you.
ペンシルバニア大学古典学科の准教授であり、古代の占いを現代の直感に応用するというピーター・ストラック博士の講演。古代の人々の多くは、神々からのメッセージが自分たちを取り巻く世界に組み込まれていると想像する習慣があり、彼らが神々に相談した託戦、夢、そして犠牲にした動物には、その答えが示されたとする。占いや古代生物に関する概念など、意味の構築に関わる研究を行っている。投稿者は、前回の投稿では、この大自然の局所域に生命性を発現させるのなら、その答え内に自由度を内在させ、自己確立と自己意識を成立させる同時機能があるはず、と題して、9月12日に投稿した。 それは、この大自然に潜在するその同時機能により、人間の知的発達が野生生物に比べて格段に飛躍する要因となる機能である。その機能は、投稿者の前回の投稿直後から何件かを着想していたが、9月19日の台風最接近で、南方の熱風が運ばれてきたために気温が上昇して、午前1時から外気温が30度台で、投稿者の気力がダウンし、投稿が遅れた。投稿者は、気温の変動に左右されやすく、低温も辛いが、高温も辛い。温度的には、9月21日午前8時の外気温は 18.9 度のような気温が最も過ごしやすく気力も上り、アイデアも鮮明になる。前回の投稿直後から何件かを着想していたは、9月19日の台風最接近で気温が上昇して、午前1時台で外気温が30度に達したので、部屋にエアコンがない対策として、そういう日には水風呂に入るという対処で猛暑もしのいできた。そうすると、体温は下がり、頭も冴え始めた。そして、仮に、量子力学の自然に潜在する量子効果によって、同じ空の下に住む野生生物には、ない知的発達を成し遂げた人間の何が、その高度な知性を獲得できる要因になったのかを自問自答し始めると、案外とこれが難しい。大自然は、局所域に生命性を発現させるために、その個体内に自由度を内在させ、自己確立と自己意識も同時に成立させたと、前回の投稿では指摘したが、量子力学の大自然に潜在する量子効果は、間違いなく存在するはずだが、その唯物的ではない量子力学の動作原理と、生命の変幻的な多子性とをどう結びつけるかを考えた。これは、あくまで、仮定として、自然に潜在する量子力学が、人間の知的発達に貢献したとするなら、どのような様式によるのかを考えるのだが、水風呂で体温が低下するに従い、自分の脳も、一つの答えに修練していった。それは、人間が、ほとんど、何も、有力な知識や見識を持たない中で、一つの決断あるいは、答えを捻出する場合、それは、その人間の直感から出されると思うが、その直感には、自然に潜在する量子力学は何も貢献しないのだろうか、という疑問だ。ちょうど、水風呂で、このようなことを考えている自分とよく合致している。量子力学的思考としての人間の意志や直感は、マクロな神経系の励起として発信しない。元来、古代から文字様式や書物は使われており、ギリシャでは哲学者が活発な議論を繰り広げていた。しかし、多くの人間たちは、現代ほどの知識や情報もなく、治療法もわからない疾病にでもなれば、神仏に救済を求めるのも当然の時代だ。そのギリシャ時代よりも、かなり前に現れたのがキリストであり、キリストの面前で救済を超えば、不思議な力で、疾病は治癒したり緩和したと史実には記されている。量子力学は、自然に潜在して、人間の知的発達に貢献した可能性を探求しているが、キリストの奇跡は、量子力学とは何も関係しないことなのか。キリストの奇跡と同様の事例が、日本の明治期にも起きていて、それは、天理教の開祖となる中山美紀が、同じように難治疾病を治癒したことが記されている。時代は明治期なので、ある程度の信憑性もあると思えるが、神格化によってそれを信じる人間の自然治癒力の相乗効果も合わさって起きたことなのか。しかし、突き詰めれば、知識や情報が皆無であっても、この大自然を動かす原動力の中に、そのような不思議な作用が潜在していると信じることで、何の手がかりもない状況から、何らかの直感や答えが導き出されるのだろうか。それは、この自然に、 そのような不思議な作用があるとしても、受け手の方の個人差もあるだろう。そこから、今回の主題である、量子力学的思考としての人間の直感は探求されるのである。この直感は、様々な方面に使用され、占いをはじめ、遠隔投資や予知、予言など超能力全般へと波及していく。例えば、カード占いでカード配列が不吉な配列であるとき、自然に潜在する量子力学的作用が、そのような配列を作り出したといえば、量子力学を知っている人には、あたかもそれらしく聞こえるかもしれない。投稿者も、この相関影響は探求すべき課題だと思っているが、その前に占い、料金何千何百円ほどの占いカードに対して、奇跡を起こす神格者ほどの信頼を置いているのかと問いたい。占い師も、依頼者の機嫌を取るために、カードの配列意味とは違う解釈をするかもしれない。このように、何の知識も手がかりもない状況からでも、直感や答えは導き出されていく。人は、それを生まれ持った好奇心というかもしれない。あるいは生来的な探求心かもしれない。知識や情報も、なく治療法もわからない疾病に罹患した場合から出発したが、その強迫観念的な衝動が人間の知的発展に寄与したのは間違いないだろう。それから、チャール・マーズが言うハードプロブレムは、ただ物的な脳科学を優先する考えであり、脳神経系の興奮伝播によって、意志や思考が作られるとするが、まず、意志や意識が揮発した後で脳神経系は励起するのであり、リベットの提唱とは逆であって、これは、意志や意識は、量子力学の微細量子集団の活動から生起するから、今の科学測定では、マクロな神経励起とは違って、微細な集団運動は検出されない。投稿者は、金儲け目的で投稿しているわけではないから、視聴者の増減を気にすることはない。投稿の目的は、投稿者の達成感を得ることが第一であり、投稿自体を仕事にすることはない。なぜなら、投稿内容は、時代を切り開く役割のために、新規かつ斬新なものにならざるを得ず、そんなアイデアを毎日創出できるほど、投稿者の脳は常習的、機械的ではない。